It was one of those bitterly cold nights when you can hear wood crackle miles away and smell the faint trace of pine smoke in the wind, the kind of night when every log in the fire feels like a small act of survival. I was half asleep when I saw movement on my porch camera, and at first I thought it was a stray raccoon again, but the shape that bent over my woodpile wasn't furry or four-legged. It was Karen, my HOA neighbor, in her bright pink bathrobe and slippers, lugging my firewood into her fancy little wheelbarrow like she was robbing a bank at midnight. The most absurd part wasn't even the theft. It was the fact that she stopped midway, straightened her back, looked right at my camera, and gave a smug little wave before rolling away like she was proud of it. That was the night I realized two things. 1, my neighbor was out of her mind, and 2, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. By morning, I'd already checked the footage twice, and called my buddy Rick to confirm I wasn't hallucinating from lack of sleep. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee and said, "Man, you got a live one. Only in your HOA." The video spread like wildfire in our neighborhood group chat. Some neighbors laughed, others acted shocked, and of course, Karen played innocent. She commented under the video saying, "That's my woodpile. Community resource." The audacity made my blood boil. I'd stacked those logs for weeks, hauling them down from the tree line after last spring's storm. Every piece had my sweat in it, and now this woman was claiming it was shared property. That afternoon, I walked over to her house, still trying to keep it civil. She was in her yard, fussing over her manicured hedge like a queen in exile. "Karen," I started, "I saw you taking my firewood last night. Can we talk about that?" She didn't even flinch. "Oh, that?" she said casually. "It's just wood. The HOA policy says visible materials on shared view property can be used for community comfort." I blinked. "Community comfort? You mean your fireplace?" She smiled like she was giving a TED Talk. "Exactly. It's freezing and you have plenty. You should be happy to share with your neighbors." I felt my patience dissolve right there. "Karen, my porch isn't shared view property. It's private. That's theft." She gave me that signature Karen look, eyebrows raised, lips pursed. "Theft? Please. I'm helping maintain neighborhood aesthetics by reducing clutter. Besides, if you don't want people touching it, maybe hide it better." That last line hit me like a challenge. I could have reported her, sure. But I knew from experience that the HOA board was basically her fan club. Complaints against her vanished faster than snow in spring. So instead I smiled and said, "All right. I'll fix that." She looked pleased, thinking she'd won, and went back to pruning her bushes. Over the next few days I tried to let it go. But every morning more logs disappeared. First 10, then 20. I started marking them with chalk just to track how fast they went. In 3 nights, she'd cleared half my pile. When I caught her again on the camera, she was humming Christmas songs while loading up her Lexus trunk. I swear, she even stopped to wipe her hands like a professional lumber thief. I wanted to march over that very minute, but something in me said wait. Document everything. So I did. I set up an extra camera under the eave, adjusted the floodlight angle, and collected every bit of evidence like a detective on a glitter-covered crime scene. By the weekend, I'd had enough. I filed a formal complaint to the HOA, complete with time-stamped footage. A week later, I got their official response. "Dear resident," it began in that condescending HOA tone, "please ensure all outdoor storage remains aesthetically compliant. Excessive firewood constitutes clutter and violates Section 14B of the Neighborhood Presentation Policy." They fined me $50. I actually laughed out loud reading it. They'd ignored my footage and punished me instead. It was so perfectly absurd it almost felt scripted. So, I called the HOA president, Mr. Jennings, who also happened to be Karen's bridge partner. "Jennings," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "you saw the video, right?" He sighed heavily. "Look, Mike, Karen said she was removing it for safety. The pile was too close to your porch wall, potential fire hazard. She did you a favor." I nearly choked. A favor? She's burning it in her fireplace. Jennings coughed awkwardly. We can revisit the issue in the spring review. Click. I realized then that reasoning wasn't going to fix this. Logic was useless when the system was rigged by people sipping tea together every Thursday. The next day, I caught Karen again, this time in daylight, wearing oversized sunglasses like she was in a spy movie. She was rolling her little wheelbarrow full of my wood down the cul-de-sac when I stepped out and said, "Morning, Karen. How's the community comfort supply holding up?" She froze, then smiled sweetly. "Lovely, thanks to you. You should be proud of being such a generous neighbor." Her tone was syrupy enough to rot teeth. "Generous isn't the word I'd use," I said, crossing my arms. "Persistent thief might be closer." She gasped dramatically. "How dare you? I'll report this hostility to the HOA." I smiled back. "Go ahead. I already sent them the footage." That rattled her. For the first time, she didn't have a quick comeback. She pushed her wheelbarrow faster, mumbling about ungrateful residents. I watched her go, and that's when the idea started forming. It was subtle at first, a spark really. Something between frustration and inspiration. If I couldn't beat her through logic, maybe I could beat her through irony. I wanted her to take the bait again, but this time it wouldn't end in my loss. That evening, I went online and started reading about harmless prank materials. I wasn't looking to hurt anyone, just to make a point in a way no HOA meeting could ignore. I found my answer in a DIY forum about party effects, glitter logs. The concept was simple: drill into wooden logs, pack them with color-safe glitter, seal them up, and when they burned, they'd shoot out shimmering clouds like a Vegas show gone wrong. It was theatrical, harmless, and poetic. The thought of Karen lighting one up during her smug little fireplace evenings made me grin like a lunatic. Still, I wasn't ready to act. Not yet. I needed her to make one more move, one last theft to justify my masterpiece. Over the next few days, I restocked my woodpile and left a few hollow logs mixed in, plain enough to tempt, perfect enough to trap. Each night, I'd glance at my camera feed like I was watching a nature documentary. And sure enough, the creature returned. Around midnight, Karen crept out again, bundled in a leopard print coat this time, whispering to herself as she loaded the new pile. I couldn't hear every word, but one line stood out: "He'll never notice." I smiled at the screen and whispered back, "Oh, Karen. You have no idea." That was the night I decided my patience had officially burned out, and soon, so would her perfect little image of control. By the next morning the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers about the footage and the fine the HOA had slapped on me. I could feel the invisible eyes from every house as I pulled my truck out for work. Some neighbors gave me sympathetic nods, others quickly looked away like siding with me was a risk they couldn't afford. Karen, on the other hand, stood in her driveway pretending to sweep invisible dust off the pavement, her smug grin never fading. It was clear she'd turned the story around and painted herself as the heroic enforcer saving the community from my supposed negligence. By lunchtime, I'd received 3 passive-aggressive emails from the HOA reminding me to maintain neighborhood harmony. The irony was suffocating. That night I sat on my porch staring at the half-empty wood rack and realized the problem wasn't just Karen, it was the entire system that enabled her. I had evidence, logic, and common sense on my side, but she had influence, manipulation, and a silver tongue. Still, I wasn't about to back down. If she wanted a game, I'd play it better than she could ever imagine. The next HOA meeting was only a few days away, and I made sure to attend. The community hall was packed, a mix of retirees, young couples, and the usual gossip ring clustered around Karen like bees to sugar. She wore a bright red blazer, the kind of thing you'd wear to court if you were trying too hard to look innocent. Mr. Jennings, the HOA president, tapped his pen against the clipboard and said, "All right, let's start with the issue regarding outdoor storage." Everyone turned toward me. I stood up, handed him a USB drive and said, "Before we start, I'd like the board to view this." He plugged it into the projector, and the footage played. The room fell silent as Karen's image appeared, shoving logs into her wheelbarrow at midnight. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen shot to her feet instantly. "That's an invasion of privacy." "He's spying on me," she yelled, but her voice cracked halfway through. Jennings cleared his throat nervously. "Karen, this seems concerning." She scrambled for excuses. "It's edited. He's framing me." I crossed my arms and said calmly, "The timestamps match the night she filed her safety complaint. If that's community service, then I must have misunderstood the term." The crowd started murmuring again, half amused, half scandalized. For a second, I thought the board might actually do the right thing. But then Jennings sighed and said, "Let's not escalate personal disputes in a public meeting. We'll handle this privately." And just like that, the conversation was buried under new business. I left that meeting with my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Outside, a few neighbors quietly patted my shoulder, whispering things like, "Hang in there, Mike," and "You know she's got them wrapped around her finger." It was some comfort, but not enough. When I got home, I checked my cameras again out of habit. Around 11 p.m., the motion sensor pinged, and there she was again, bold as ever. This time she wasn't even sneaky. She brought her son, a college kid built like a linebacker, to help load the logs. I watched them laughing as they carried my wood into the back of her SUV. That was the breaking point. I realized the glitter logs couldn't just be a prank, they had to be poetic justice. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and picked up supplies. Hollow drill bits, metallic paint, clear epoxy, and a few bags of ultrafine glitter in gold, silver, and fuchsia. The cashier gave me a weird look as I piled everything on the counter. "Big art project?" she asked. I smiled and said, "You could call it that." When I got home, I spent the evening working in my shed, drilling small cavities into select logs, mixing glitter with epoxy, and sealing the openings so perfectly no one could tell. When the light hit them, they looked just slightly shinier than the rest, enough to catch Karen's greedy eye. By the time I finished, my hands were coated in glitter, and my workbench sparkled like a disco floor. I laughed for the first time in days. 2 nights later, Karen struck again. This time, I didn't hide inside. I watched from the window as she whispered to her son, pointing at the shiny new logs. "Take those," she said, and he obeyed. I could barely contain my excitement. The bait had worked perfectly. They loaded the glitter-packed logs into her SUV and drove off, unaware they were carrying the equivalent of a rainbow bomb. I waited, heart pounding, for the aftermath. It came faster than I expected. The following evening, I was sitting on the porch sipping hot cocoa when I heard sirens and shouting from down the street. I jogged over and saw a plume of sparkling dust rising from Karen's chimney. It looked like her fireplace had exploded into a carnival. Neighbors were gathered on their lawns pointing and laughing as glitter burst from her windows and roof vents, carried by the smoke like some absurd fireworks display. Karen stumbled outside coughing, covered head to toe in sparkles, looking like a deranged Christmas ornament. Her son followed, sneezing out flecks of silver. Firefighters arrived minutes later, equally confused but clearly trying not to laugh as they checked for real flames. I hung back in the crowd, doing my best to look concerned. "Is everyone okay?" I asked innocently. Karen spotted me and shrieked, "You did this! You sabotaged my fireplace!" She lunged forward, waving her glitter-coated hands like she was throwing fairy dust. "You'll pay for this." I raised an eyebrow. "Karen, why would I do that? I thought those were community logs." Her mouth opened, then closed again as the realization hit her. She couldn't admit to stealing them without confessing. The crowd caught on fast, and laughter rippled through the onlookers. Someone even yelled, "Guess community comfort comes with style now." The firefighters found no real damage, just a ridiculous amount of glitter fused to her brick hearth. One of them chuckled and said, "Ma'am, you're lucky. Could have been worse if this wasn't non-toxic material." That only made her angrier. She stormed back inside, leaving a trail of sparkles behind her like a glitter comet. The next morning, half the cul-de-sac was talking about it. Photos had already circulated in the local chat groups. Karen's glitter explosion, Sparklegate, the fabulous fire. Even the HOA couldn't ignore it. But instead of admitting defeat, Karen doubled down. She called an emergency HOA session claiming sabotage, vandalism, and emotional distress. I attended with my phone ready, playing back the old footage of her stealing the wood for everyone to see again. Jennings looked cornered. "Karen, did you or did you not take Mr. Coleman's firewood?" She stammered. "I borrowed it. Temporarily." Jennings sighed. "Then how exactly was it sabotaged?" She froze, eyes darting between me and the crowd. The silence was priceless. Finally, Jennings muttered something about needing to review policy violations. I could see the cracks forming in their precious hierarchy. Later that day, I found a note taped to my mailbox written in fancy cursive. It said, "You think you're clever. This isn't over." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. She was furious, humiliated, and still trying to play the victim. But underneath that bravado, I could sense she was losing her grip. Her allies on the board were distancing themselves, the neighborhood was mocking her, and every time the wind blew, a fresh shimmer of glitter drifted out of her chimney like a reminder of karma. For the first time since this nonsense began, I felt a strange calm settle in. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the peace of knowing justice, however ridiculous, had finally balanced the scales. Still, I knew Karen well enough to realize she wouldn't let it go quietly. She'd find another angle, another rule, another way to make my life miserable. But that was fine, because now I had the neighborhood's sympathy, the evidence on my side, and her reputation crumbling faster than a damp log. The balance had shifted, and she didn't even see it yet. I looked at the faint trail of glitter that still sparkled on my boots and smiled to myself. If she wanted to keep playing games, I had plenty more tricks left in the shed. For the next few days after the glitter fiasco, the neighborhood buzzed like a kicked beehive. Every conversation at the mailboxes and every post in the community chat circled back to Karen's sparkling disaster. It had become an urban legend. Overnight neighbors joked about installing glitter detectors, and a few even sent me winking emojis, though no one dared say out loud that they knew I was behind it. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling faster than a cheap scarf. She spent hours every day trying to scrub glitter from her wall's driveway, and even her dog, which still shimmered faintly like a disco ball in sunlight every time she walked past my house, she glared so hard it could have set fire to the air around us. I pretended not to notice, sipping coffee on my porch, while the faint breeze carried away tiny flecks of pink glitter like poetic justice floating through the air. By the third day I thought maybe things would calm down, maybe she'd finally accept defeat, but Karen wasn't built to lose quietly. I found out just how far she'd go when I got an official letter from the HOA shoved into my mailbox. No envelope, just a single printed page with the heading "Notice of Property Violation." I didn't even need to open it to know who was behind it. Still, I read it for the comedic value. According to the letter, I was in violation for improper waste disposal, environmental hazard, potential contamination, and unsafe materials stored on private property. In other words, they were accusing me of dumping glitter into the neighborhood ecosystem. I laughed out loud. It was so ridiculous I could almost admire the creativity behind the accusation. Karen was weaponizing bureaucracy like it was her personal sword. That evening I drove down to the next town over, where my friend Rick owned a small outdoor supply shop. He'd been following the story online since it blew up. He nearly fell off his chair laughing when he saw me walk in. "You're a local hero, man," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Half the people in town are talking about Karen's glitter fire." I grinned. "Yeah, well, the Queen is plotting her revenge. Apparently I'm being charged with environmental terrorism." Rick snorted and said, "If she keeps pushing this, you should go bigger." "What's bigger than glitter?" I asked. He leaned closer with a mischievous grin. "Sound she hates noise, right?" The thought simmered in my head all night. The next morning, I woke up with an idea, not just to retaliate, but to expose the HOA for their hypocrisy. I started by gathering everything I had documented, every email, every fine, every message, every video of Karen stealing, and every screenshot of her contradictory comments. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about showing how the HOA had been enabling her nonsense for months. I decided to make it public, not online yet, but locally. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday. I circled the date in red and started preparing my presentation. I even borrowed a small projector from Rick and printed enlarged screenshots of Karen's glitter explosion that were already floating around the group chat. I planned it like a courtroom case, every lie, every violation, every stolen log cross-referenced and time-stamped. I wanted her cornered by her own arrogance. On the night of the meeting, the hall was fuller than ever. Clearly word had spread. Karen arrived first dressed like she was attending a royal hearing, wearing sunglasses indoors, and carrying a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. When she saw me walk in with my little projector bag, her expression flickered between panic and fury. Mr. Jennings looked exhausted, probably dreading whatever was about to unfold. I waited for the agenda to reach community conduct, then calmly stood up and said I'd like to present evidence regarding recent incidents. Jennings rubbed his temples but nodded. Fine, make it brief. I connected the projector and started rolling the footage. Karen creeping at midnight, taking my wood, her emails, her texts, her denials. Every frame filled the wall behind me. People whispered, gasped, laughed. Karen jumped to her feet, shouting, "It's fake, he's manipulating you all," but her words drowned under the weight of her own voice from the recordings. Then I switched to the final slide, a still photo of her glitter-covered living room taken from the public Facebook post her niece had uploaded. Before quickly deleting it, the room erupted in laughter. Jennings couldn't suppress his grin. Karen turned red as a tomato, muttering something about legal action, but the damage was done. That's when I delivered the punchline. I said calmly, "The HOA claims I've violated environmental safety, but the only contaminant here is the abuse of power. When neighbors can steal and lie and still hide behind board policies, then the real problem isn't glitter, it's corruption." I could see heads nodding, people whispering in agreement. The tide was turning. Karen tried to recover. She pointed at me and shrieked, "This is harassment. He's obsessed with me. He's dangerous." Jennings finally banged his gavel. "Enough, Karen, sit down. We'll handle this civilly." But she didn't. She stormed out of the hall, shouting threats as glitter sparkled on her blazer under the fluorescent light. Once she was gone, the room felt lighter. Neighbors clapped me on the shoulder, thanked me, even offered to co-sign a petition to review the HOA leadership. I went home that night with a strange sense of calm but also caution, because people like Karen don't vanish, they retreat, regroup, and strike harder. Sure enough, the next morning I found my mailbox vandalized, not broken but stuffed full of ashes and half-burned paper. I pulled it out and realized it was a scorched copy of the HOA handbook, with a note scribbled in marker, "Enjoy your freedom, Sparkler." That one made me laugh despite myself. She was losing control, resorting to petty intimidation tactics, but I knew better than to rise to every provocation. Instead, I focused on tightening my defenses. I upgraded my cameras, added floodlights, and installed motion alarms by the shed. If she wanted a battle, I'd give her one, where every move she made was caught on tape. For the next few nights I barely slept. The security feed became my favorite channel. I'd sit with coffee watching for movement. Nothing happened until the fourth night around midnight. The sensor pinged again. There she was, creeping around my backyard, flashlight in hand, muttering to herself. I zoomed in on the feed and nearly dropped my cup. She wasn't stealing wood this time. She was scattering something across my lawn, probably glitter or maybe salt, trying to get some childish revenge. I quietly stepped out the back door and said, "Evening, Karen, planning another community improvement." She froze. The flashlight beam wobbled across the grass. Her face twisted into that fake sweet smile she always used when caught off guard. "Oh, Mike, I was just checking the property line," she stammered. "Thought I saw a wild animal." I took a step closer, eyes on the little pouch in her hand. "Funny, it looks like the only animal here is you." She turned red, dropped the bag, and bolted toward her fence. The next morning I checked the lawn. The bag was still there, filled with what turned out to be powdered chalk mixed with glitter. She'd actually tried to mark my grass with some kind of humiliation tactic. I bagged it for evidence, just in case. When the sun rose I could see faint pink trails across the yard, but honestly it looked kind of pretty. I almost wanted to leave it that way. By now the story had grown beyond either of us. The local Facebook group was full of memes comparing Karen to a glitter dragon and me to some kind of folk hero. One post even said justice sparkles brightest at midnight. The absurdity of it all made me laugh until my sides hurt. But beneath the humor I knew it wasn't over, because people like Karen always have one last tantrum left in them. Her pride had been bruised, her authority challenged, and that combination was dangerous. So I started thinking ahead. What would she do next? File another complaint, tamper with my stuff again, maybe try to sue me for emotional distress? I couldn't predict her next move, but I could prepare for it, and part of me almost welcomed it, because by now this wasn't just about revenge, it was about principle. She'd spent months controlling the neighborhood through fear and manipulation, and if it took glitter and stubbornness to expose her, then so be it. I looked out over the faintly sparkling grass, the morning light catching each speck like 1,000 tiny trophies, and I thought to myself, sometimes justice doesn't come clean, sometimes it shines. Karen's silence after the meeting didn't last long, and by the end of the week, she was back at it, more determined than ever. This time she played it smart, or so she thought. She started going door to door pretending to be the victim, telling everyone that I was a bully who had humiliated her publicly and destroyed her fireplace on purpose. She even claimed that the glitter fumes had caused her breathing issues. The neighborhood was split in half. Again, some people believed her while others just shook their heads and said they'd seen enough to know the truth. I kept quiet for a while, because I knew sooner or later her need for attention would dig her own hole deeper than I ever could. The problem was she didn't just stop at gossip. She began to push the HOA for something new, an inspection committee dedicated to enforcing clean property standards. In reality, it was just a cover to let her snoop around people's yards legally, and of course, I was first on her list. The following Monday morning I woke to the sound of knocking. When I opened the door, 3 people stood there, clipboards in hand and bright vests that said HOA Inspection Team. One of them was Mr. Jennings, looking deeply uncomfortable, while Karen hovered in the back pretending to check something on her phone. I folded my arms and said, "Really, this is how we're doing things now?" Jennings sighed. "Mike, please, just cooperate, it'll be quick," Karen piped up with her fake cheerful tone. "We're just ensuring community compliance, nothing personal." I let them in because I had nothing to hide. The backyard was clean, my tools neatly hung, the new woodpile stacked perfectly. I even had fresh grass where the glitter incident had happened. Jennings glanced around, gave a half nod, but Karen wasn't satisfied. She paced around pretending to take photos, muttering about suspicious storage. I watched her hover near my shed, and finally said, "Unless you have a warrant, you're not stepping in there." She smirked and said, "If you've got nothing to hide, why not show us?" I smiled back, "Because unlike you, I actually respect property lines." She turned red but couldn't say anything. They left after 20 minutes with nothing to report, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. She wanted to find something, anything to use against me later. That evening I found a note on my windshield that said, "Enjoy the peace while it lasts," written in her unmistakable handwriting. I tossed it in the trash and decided it was time to start thinking ahead, because Karen wasn't going to quit. She wanted control over everyone, and if I didn't stop her, she'd eventually move on to the next neighbor. I spent that night brainstorming and scrolling through neighborhood laws online. I discovered something interesting, a clause buried deep in the HOA charter that said any resident could call for a vote to dissolve the current board if misconduct or bias could be proven. That got me thinking, maybe instead of reacting to her, I could end her reign altogether. The next day, I quietly started talking to neighbors one by one, starting with the ones Karen had alienated over the years. There were plenty of them. Mrs. Collins, whose garden decorations Karen had fined for being too whimsical; the Mitchells, whose kids' basketball hoop she demanded removed; even old Mr. Harlan, who'd been forced to repaint his fence twice because she didn't like the color. Within 2 days, I had half the street ready to sign a petition. They were tired of her drama, tired of paying fines for nonsense, and tired of pretending she was helping anyone. It felt good to finally be doing something bigger than my own revenge. It felt like balance was coming back. But of course word got back to her before long. Karen confronted me in the middle of the street one afternoon. While I was mowing the lawn, she marched right up red-faced, and waving a piece of paper. "How dare you try to undermine the board?" she snapped. "This is harassment." I turned off the mower, leaned on the handle, and said, "You mean democracy?" Her jaw tightened. "You think you're some kind of hero, but you're a troublemaker, and the HOA won't stand for this." I shrugged. "Maybe it's time for a new HOA then." She jabbed her finger toward my chest. "Don't test me, Mike, you'll regret it." I gave her a calm smile. "Already have, Karen," and walked away, leaving her sputtering behind me. That night it rained hard, thunder rolling across the sky, and for once the world felt quiet, but the calm didn't last. Around midnight, I heard a strange banging sound near the shed. I looked out, and saw a shadow moving. The camera feed confirmed it. Karen again, this time, wearing a raincoat, hood up, flashlight in hand. She was fiddling with something near the side gate. I slipped on my boots, and grabbed my phone, recording. As I went outside, the rain hit my face like needles. I shouted over the storm, "Karen! What the hell are you doing?" She spun around, startled for a second before her expression hardened. "This isn't your property," she yelled. "The gate line is public." I laughed. "Really? Because last I checked, that's my fence." She tried to grab something from the ground, and I saw what it was: one of my marked logs she'd stolen earlier, now tossed back near the corner, probably hoping to frame me for dumping again. I kept my distance, and said, "You're really obsessed with me, aren't you?" She screamed something incoherent and stormed off, splashing through the mud. I filmed the whole thing, including her license plate, as she drove away. The next morning I forwarded the video to Jennings with a polite message explaining that this was harassment and trespassing. Within hours, he called back sounding weary. "Mike, I saw the footage. I can't cover for her anymore. The board's meeting tonight to discuss disciplinary action." I thanked him, but I already had bigger plans. The signatures for the petition were ready, more than enough to call a vote, and I intended to bring it to that same meeting. When evening came, the room was packed again, even more people than last time. Karen looked frazzled, still sparkling faintly under the lights from the rain. She started off defensively, blaming everyone for gossip, and claiming she was targeted unfairly, but then I stood up, held up the petition, and said, "This isn't about targeting, this is about fairness. The neighbors deserve a board that serves them, not one that serves itself." I handed the papers to Jennings. He read through them slowly, then looked up and said, "According to the charter, this meets the requirement for a vote." Karen exploded, shouting, "This is illegal, this is mutiny." People started talking at once, laughter mixed with shouting. Jennings tried to gavel the room quiet, but the momentum was unstoppable. One by one the neighbors stood up, voicing their complaints, years of pent-up frustration pouring out. The meeting stretched for hours, until finally Jennings called the vote. The result was overwhelming, 80% in favor of dissolving the current board. Karen's reign was officially over. She stormed out again, slamming the door so hard the decorations rattled. It was poetic, like a final scene from a movie. Walking home that night, the rain had stopped, the air smelled fresh, and for the first time in months I felt a real sense of peace. But I knew Karen wouldn't disappear completely. People like her never do. They just retreat, lick their wounds, and find new ways to cause chaos. Still, I had something she didn't: community support, and that made all the difference. The next morning I woke up to a brighter world, the sky clear, the streets quiet, even the birds seemed to sing louder. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and noticed something in my yard glinting under the sun, a faint trail of glitter still embedded in the grass from all those chaotic weeks. I smiled, shaking my head. Maybe it was fitting after all that madness that the only thing left behind was a little sparkle, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't anger or punishment, it's simply standing your ground and letting karma do its work. The week after the board dissolved was one of the strangest in recent memory, because for the first time in years the neighborhood actually felt quiet, without Karen marching around with her clipboard barking orders at people and pretending she ran the world. It was almost unsettling how peaceful it was. At first I thought maybe she had accepted defeat, maybe she would move away, start over somewhere else, but then I saw her Lexus still parked in her driveway, and the faint glimmer of glitter still clinging to the paint like the universe reminding her that no matter what she did she couldn't scrub away her reputation. I didn't see her for a few days after that, until one afternoon when I came home from work and found a thick envelope shoved into my mailbox. Inside was a legal notice. She was suing me for defamation, emotional distress, and property damage. I actually laughed out loud, because the entire thing was so predictable. It was like watching a bad sequel to a movie that should have ended. Gracefully, she had no evidence, nothing except her pride, and the stubborn belief that if she screamed loud enough someone would still believe her. I called my lawyer friend Tom, who owed me a few favors from back when I helped him rebuild his deck. He read through the papers and started chuckling halfway through. "Mike, she's out of her mind," he said. "She's basing her claim on your supposed tampering with firewood and mental anguish from online ridicule." I asked him if we should take it seriously. He said, "We'll respond properly, but honestly she doesn't have a leg to stand on. Her own footage will destroy her case. Just keep everything documented." Which I already had meticulously. Every video, every screenshot, every incident. I had built a folder so thick it could double as a doorstop. I sent him everything, and for the first time since this madness started I felt like the fight was finally leaning my way. A few days later, I saw Karen again. She was standing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, yelling at someone, probably her lawyer. When she noticed me, she froze, then gave a sarcastic little wave. I waved back, just as cheerfully, and went about trimming my hedge, pretending her existence didn't matter, which I could tell irritated her more than any insult could. Over the next week, she started making small moves to claw back control, petty stuff like parking slightly across my driveway or leaving her trash cans half a foot over the property line. Little passive-aggressive power plays that screamed desperation. I ignored them all the more she tried. The smaller she seemed. The neighborhood, too, had begun to change in subtle ways. People were friendlier now. Kids rode bikes again, without fear of some ridiculous fine for noise. Mrs. Collins put up her garden gnomes again, and the Mitchells reinstalled their basketball hoop. It was as if Karen's absence had allowed everyone to breathe again. The lawsuit, however, was still hanging over us, and the hearing date came faster than expected. I dressed neatly, brought all my documents, and met Tom at the courthouse. Karen arrived in a dramatic beige suit and oversized sunglasses, like she was walking into a reality show finale. She gave me a smirk that said she thought this was her comeback moment. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Her lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive neighbor who humiliated her for sport, claiming the glitter stunt had caused her psychological trauma. The judge listened politely, then asked a simple question: "Did you or did you not take the firewood without permission?" Karen hesitated, stammered something about community resources. The judge raised an eyebrow and said, "So you admit to taking it?" Karen froze again, and in that instant the entire case fell apart. Tom presented the footage, the emails, the HOA fines, everything. The judge dismissed the case within 15 minutes. Karen's jaw dropped. She tried to protest, but her lawyer had already started packing up his files. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than air. Tom clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well, that's that. She can appeal, but I doubt she has the stomach for another round." I thanked him and promised him the best barbecue night he'd ever had that evening. The news spread fast through the neighborhood. The lawsuit had been dismissed. People came by to congratulate me. Even Jennings, who had resigned from the board, dropped by to apologize. He admitted Karen had manipulated him, and that he should have stood up earlier. I told him not to worry, that the whole thing had been a lesson for everyone. He nodded and said quietly, "You know, Mike, you might want to consider joining the new board. We could use someone who's not afraid to push back." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was serious. Over the next few days life began returning to normal, though normal felt almost foreign without the constant drama. One morning I saw a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible? Was she actually leaving? I stood at my window pretending to sip coffee, and watched as movers carried box after box out of her house. Karen came out once, giving orders, pacing back and forth, her hair tied in a messy bun. She looked tired, older, smaller. Somehow it hit me Then that beneath all her arrogance she was just someone who couldn't stand losing control of her world. As the last box went in she turned and for a moment our eyes met. She didn't wave or glare, just stared blankly, then got into her car and drove off without a word. I watched the taillights fade down the street and realized it was over. The glitter war, the endless complaints, the late-night trespassing, all of it gone with her departure. The weeks that followed were almost surreal. Without her the neighborhood thrived. We held our first community barbecue in years. Everyone brought something. The kids ran around chasing each other through the yards, and someone even made glitter cupcakes as a joke. When they handed me one I nearly choked laughing. The sun was setting, warm golden light spilling across the lawns, and for the first time I felt what this place was supposed to be: peaceful, friendly, a community, not a battlefield. Rick came over with a beer and said, "Man, you turned this neighborhood from a soap opera into a comedy." I grinned and said maybe that's what it needed, some sparkle to shake things up. But even as life settled into calm there were small reminders of everything that had happened. Every time it rained the drainage near my porch would sparkle faintly from the leftover glitter embedded in the soil. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a few rogue specks across the driveway. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been permanently dusted with a faint shimmer, a quiet symbol of everything we had endured and somehow survived. One evening as I sat on the porch watching the sunset I thought about how it had all started with a few missing logs, and how something so petty had spiraled into a full-blown war, yet through it all there had been something strangely human about it. The pride, the pettiness, the humor, the small victories. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about standing up for yourself, even when the odds were ridiculous. A few days later I got a letter from the new HOA committee thanking me for my role in helping restore balance. They even invited me to attend their first official meeting as a guest. I went mostly out of curiosity, and to my surprise, it was genuinely civil. People talked like adults, no shouting, no power trips. The new president even joked about adding a no unauthorized firewood sharing clause. Everyone laughed, including me. After the meeting ended, a few neighbors approached to ask if I would consider joining permanently. I smiled and said I'd think about it, though deep down I knew I probably would. It felt good to be part of something that wasn't built on ego and fear anymore. That night as I walked home the air was cool and the moonlight glinted off the tiny bits of glitter still caught in the cracks of the pavement like a constellation underfoot. I paused at my old woodpile, now neatly covered with a tarp and padlocked out of habit. I remembered that first night months ago, seeing her stealing in the dark, and the rage that had consumed me back then. It felt distant now, almost absurd that one small act of theft had set off a chain of chaos that ended up changing everything. I smiled quietly to myself, realizing that in a strange way maybe I should thank her, because without all that madness the neighborhood would still be living under her thumb. Maybe it took a little glitter to expose the truth, and as I turned to go inside I couldn't help but laugh softly, thinking maybe that was the universe's way of reminding us all that sometimes justice really does shine. Months passed after Karen's departure, and the neighborhood slowly transformed into something that finally felt like home, the kind of place where people waved at each other from their porches, where laughter replaced tension, and where children's shouts didn't spark HOA complaints anymore. I didn't realize how much peace had been missing until I finally had it. Mornings were quiet, except for the sound of birds and the soft hum of sprinklers. My coffee tasted better without the sour aftertaste of annoyance, and when I looked across the street at Karen's old house, now empty, and still, I felt no anger, just relief. Eventually a new family moved in, a young couple with 2 energetic kids and a golden retriever. They introduced themselves right away, bringing over a plate of cookies and asking if the neighborhood had any funny stories. I almost laughed too hard to answer. I told them vaguely that things used to be a little more dramatic around here. They smiled, not realizing the battlefield they had unknowingly inherited. As weeks turned into months, little traces of Karen's era continued to fade. Her ridiculous fines were overturned, her endless rules revoked, and her name quietly removed from every HOA document. The new committee ran things differently: open meetings, real discussions, and transparency, something unheard of before. I didn't expect to care much about neighborhood politics anymore, but somehow I found myself attending every meeting. Not out of revenge or habit, but because I wanted to make sure this peace lasted one evening. During a particularly calm discussion about park maintenance, the new president announced that several seats were open and asked if anyone wanted to volunteer. People glanced around, and a few hands went up. Then Jennings, who had returned as a regular member, turned toward me and said, "Why don't you, Mike? You've earned it." For a second I hesitated, remembering all the nonsense that came with power, but the room was smiling, waiting expectantly, so I agreed. The applause that followed was modest but genuine, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time: pride. The next few weeks were a blur of small victories: fixing the community garden, helping repaint the park benches, organizing the first ever neighborhood cleanup. It was strange how the same energy Karen had used to control people could be used to bring them together. Sometimes at the end of meetings I'd glance at her old empty chair and imagine her reaction, probably fuming somewhere, watching through a window, shaking her head that the world had dared to move on without her. But I didn't think about her much anymore. Life was finally simple again, until one afternoon when I came home and found a small unmarked package on my porch. No return address, just my name written in neat cursive. For a moment my stomach tightened, because I recognized that handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single mason jar filled with glitter, silver, gold, and pink mixed together, with a small note that said, "Thought you might miss the sparkle." No signature. But it didn't need one. I stood there staring at it, half amused, half unsettled. Was it a joke, a piece offering a reminder of war? I didn't know, but I placed it on my shelf anyway, maybe because in some twisted way it symbolized closure. The neighborhood barbecue that summer was the biggest we'd ever had. Every house participated, even the new family brought a bounce house for the kids. People brought dishes from every culture. Tables overflowed with food, and laughter filled the air. Someone even set up speakers playing old rock songs. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned orange, I looked around and realized that after all the madness something beautiful had grown out of it. Unity born from chaos. At one point Mrs. Collins raised her glass and shouted a toast to the man who brought back the sparkle. Everyone laughed and cheered. I blushed, but didn't correct her. Rick leaned over, grinning, and said, "You realize you're a legend now, right? They'll tell this story for years." I shook my head, smiling. "Let them tell it however they want, as long as it ends with peace, I'll take it." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat by the dying embers of the grill. The air smelled like smoke and summer. The yard was scattered with glitter confetti from the kids' decorations. It shimmered faintly under the porch light, and I found myself thinking about how funny life was, how something so ridiculous like glitter and stolen firewood had taught me more about people than anything else. It wasn't just about one crazy neighbor. It was about pride, control, fear of insignificance. Karen had tried to build her worth out of rules and domination, and when that crumbled she had nothing left to stand on. Maybe that was the saddest part. She could have been part of something real if she'd just let herself belong. As the months rolled by, her house finally sold officially to the new family, who turned it into a warm, welcoming place. They painted the exterior light blue, replaced her cold hedges with flowers, and even installed a porch swing. Sometimes I'd see the kids playing catch in the front yard, where Karen once stood, yelling at leaves falling on her driveway. It felt poetic, like nature itself was reclaiming balance, and on windy days, when sunlight hit the grass just right, I could still see a faint shimmer here and there, the last traces of the glitter buried deep in the soil, permanent proof that no matter how much anyone tries to erase the past, it leaves its mark. Some marks you resent, others you cherish. Then one afternoon months later I saw her again, purely by chance. I was at the hardware store picking up paint when I heard a familiar sharp voice arguing with the cashier about a coupon. I turned, and there she was, Karen, in a different town, her hair shorter but unmistakable, her tone still cutting as ever. For a second she didn't see me. I watched quietly as she demanded to speak to the manager. Some things never change. When she finally turned and caught sight of me, her face froze. She blinked once, then quickly turned back, pretending to browse paintbrushes. I could have walked over, said something smug, but instead I just nodded to myself, paid for my things, and left. Outside the air was cool and fresh. I laughed softly under my breath, because somehow it felt like the perfect ending. That night I went home and pulled the mason jar of glitter off the shelf, the one she'd sent months earlier. I turned it slowly in the light, watching the colors dance. It no longer reminded me of chaos, it reminded me of endurance, of patience, and the strange way life finds balance after storms. I placed it back on the mantel beside a framed picture of the barbecue, where the whole neighborhood had gathered, smiling, glowing under the golden sunset. Maybe glitter wasn't just the punchline of a petty revenge, maybe it was a symbol of resilience, of finding light in ridiculous situations, of realizing that sometimes the universe uses absurdity to restore order. I smiled, thinking about how it had all begun with something as simple as missing firewood, and how it ended with peace, laughter, and yes, a little sparkle that refused to fade. As autumn arrived, the air grew crisp, the trees turned red and gold, and one morning I stood on the porch watching the leaves drift down. The wind carried a faint glimmer, as if the world itself had decided to keep one small reminder of everything that had happened. I took a deep breath, feeling the calm settle inside me, the kind that only comes after a long fight. Finally won. Somewhere in the distance a neighbor lit a fire, and I could smell the wood smoke curling into the sky. No glitter, no chaos, just warmth and peace. I smiled and whispered to myself softly, let her have her coupons, let her argue with managers. I've already had my victory. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it just shined quietly like the faintest dust of glitter still hidden in the cracks of this neighborhood. The war was long over, but the sparkle remained forever.